I'm Travis, I'll be your moderator, and I'm going to introduce Josh Schmidt, our presenter. Josh started his career as a student worker help desk technician here at the University of Oregon College of Education in 2009, yada, yada, yada. Josh has been leveraging the latest techniques used by threat actors. BPM provides clients with the insight required to defend their networks, applications, people, physical buildings against the latest security threats. Josh has expertise in penetration testing, red team operations, adversarial threat assessment, and digital forensics. He had personally conducted over 250 penetration test engagements during his career and is a frequent presenter at industry conferences with objective educational content. All right, thank you, Josh.
Awesome, thank you, Travis. So really with that introduction, I don't think I have a whole lot more to say about myself. I think that really covered the highlights. I had a really fantastic time when I was here at the University of Oregon. And for the students in the room, first off, how many students do we have in the room? Okay, a few. So I'll still give this a little bit. So I started my career really young. I had an uncle who was an old school programmer in the 70s, and he gave me a lot of books like this one from Clifford Stoll, and that really opened my eyes to what pen testing could be. And I didn't really know what that would be called until I actually took a one-credit seminar here at the University of Oregon back in about 2009, 2010. And that really opened my eyes to like what the potential could be. And so I didn't really know how I would get into this career, but after about 5 years at the College of Education doing work as a student worker and then as a full-time employee, I was eventually able to find my way to a small startup here in town. And that's where I've been the past 12 years. And it's been a fantastic journey, and really would love to just share my experiences with what we have seen on recent engagements with cities and with counties and municipalities, and how there are common threads, and how there are certain trends and themes. How do we translate the observations that are manifesting in the real world for vulnerabilities into actionable things? So if you do not leave here today with at least something that you have learned, I have failed at my job, and I don't really like failing. So I would love any questions you do have. So if you are going to leave here and you have things unanswered, if there are things you want to know, raise your hand. I am happy to go off script, and I am happy to just engage with Q&A if there are questions that are on your mind. So beautiful picture of Alaska. This is one of the really lovely things that I like about this job is I get to go all over the country and share information and give talks like this, presentations. As someone who is from Eugene, though, this really does feel like a bit of a homecoming for me, as I live here, I work here, I've got friends and colleagues here, so this should be a really good time. This is what we are going to be talking about today. So there are several certain assessment standards. So we're going to talk about when we are doing reporting on engagements like this, what are key things that can tie back to industry standards, and you can also use these internally when building out governance and structure, because really smart people who have more time, more money, more budget than you do have already tried to solve a lot of this and give those standards and those frameworks. We do also have 3 case studies. I tossed in that third one just because I wasn't sure how we do on time, so we may or may not get to it. It depends upon if we have good conversation and questions, and then we'll jump to the wrap up there. So introduction. For these 4 frameworks, I suspect most people have heard of one or many of these. Is there anyone in this room who hasn't heard of MITRE, OWASP, NIST CSF, or CWE? Okay, then I will not spend a whole lot of time on these. These are really just great standards. CSS, of course, you break it down into your main functions and your categories. It breaks it down into the implementation. When we're reporting on things, this is what we try to tie it to, because a lot of organizations are using these control families and this governance to build their security program. MITRE, this is for the more technical folks in the room, of course. So when we are doing a particular vulnerability, this is going to be mapping that attack chain. And so when you're mapping that attack chain and you want to understand how can you fix a particular problem, like an adversary in the middle attack, if you want to understand what a peer-based name resolution attack is, this is all freely available out there. MITRE does a fantastic job of presenting this information, and so it has actionable, digestible pieces that you're then able to take this problem that you internally found or that an external consultant found, and then go apply this into actionable things to go solve this problem, instead of having to go in and read that documentation for hours on end without any of that guidance. OWASP, ASVS, on the application side, anyone in the room deal with application development? Okay, so not the majority in the room. Again, won't spend a whole lot of time here. For the ASVS, this is a really nice standard though, so if you are in the world of application development, this is a good standard to look at different tiers and different classifications of what level of security does your application need to follow, and then there are different test standards and different milestones, different activities for your level 1, 2, and 3, depending upon how sensitive the data is passing through that. And again, it has really good actionable data of if you've got your L1, L2, L3, and then mapping to the CWE framework on the right-hand side there. So depending upon how rigorous you need to go through this, your L1 going to probably be something pretty benign, not a whole lot of sensitive information, all the way up through critical applications for banking or critical infrastructure. So, first case study, medium-sized city with operational technology. So when looking at how to profile these and classify these, I like to do some general reconnaissance and put together some use case information so we can understand we all live somewhere. So how does this relate to where your house is, or your business, or where your family is, or where you come from? So this particular case study, population served around 100,000. The annual IT budget for a population of this size is around 5 million, give or take. I have obscured a little bit of this, so it's not too easy to identify what the city is, but it's somewhere within the United States. Not a particularly small IT staff, so they had about 20 or so in this organization, and then 2 of those were dedicated for doing security functions. They did, however, have a number of critical services. So not all cities have police or fire in-house. Sometimes those are outsourced. Sometimes those are part of a county contract with the sheriff. And in this case, there was also water supply. So they didn't handle water treatment, but they did supply for residents within that city. So for the scope of this engagement, it was primarily a penetration test, but it encompassed more. So we considered more of a vulnerability assessment and or a overall cyber risk assessment. So we were looking at things like the building. We were looking at how the employee security training, so likely for those of us who are in professional careers, we probably are all subject to things like KnowBe4 and various training platforms. We really wanted to see how valuable and how meaningful those trainings were, and were they resulting in the right outcomes for employee awareness. We also were asked to focus our social engineering specifically on phishing attacks. So something that maybe training platforms don't typically have a good way of measuring the efficacy of that training. So actually making social engineering phone calls. There was also CJIS data for those in the room who are familiar with the criminal justice information systems. Naturally, with a police department, is that consideration. And then we had approximately 14 days and 3 people to take a look at this. So outcomes of this were we identified some deficiencies in the service desk in particular. So making sure that there really are strong, good policies and then actionable procedures in place to make sure that people are following good verification. We typically recommend having something out of band, so maybe it's a secure word of the day, something that's on the intranet, something that if there is a reset that has to take place, the help desk technicians have the proper training in place so they aren't going and incorrectly resetting passwords and then disclosing that to someone just because they called in. There are also a number of physical deficiencies that are more interesting to talk about when we have pictures of them in a moment, so I will sort of skip over those in lieu of focusing on some of the more technical things. We did also notice that there are some interesting observations with the network access controls. So we were able to find some live internal ports and deploy rogue hosts. And then once we got that rogue host on the network, we were able to just do passive traffic capture with Wireshark, and you can see some really interesting things. And so typically when you have a network device that is, perhaps there's a CAM table that is overflowing, you're going to then start to see a lot of sensitive data just start hitting the broadcast address, and then anyone who is listening for it, with say Wireshark or T-Shark, can then start intercepting that. And we were actually able to see Kerberos tickets because there were some challenges with the infrastructure on the networking side. What does this look like from an overall flow, and then also mapping it back to some of those standards? So we saw two main paths here. So the first being those malicious phone calls and also some emails, getting the credentials and password resets. And that led to an interesting technical vulnerability on the VPN. So you see there, that is a user agent. So this is a user agent that was allowed to circumvent the conditional access policy that was in place. So they thought that they had a good cap that would prevent and require MFA, but if you change that user agent to, say, a mobile device, then we were able to circumvent that. And so we do see that in many Entra or M365 deployments, we are actually able to find sort of those edge cases. And we used to see things like EWS or Exchange Web Services years ago, and that started being disabled more and more by default. But there's still other areas like those default or security defaults that aren't being fully hardened. And then we did also see, as mentioned on the physical side, not a really great network access control in place. So this one we really didn't even need to bypass. We were just able to physically get into the buildings, as we'll talk about in the next couple slides, and some ways that we were able to do that. And then from there, we were able to abuse some of that technology debt, right? Organizations have a lot of technology debt, especially in the municipalities and in the government space. There's a lot of different systems that do require a lot of care and consideration to sunset those legacy systems and then to get secure replacements online. So these are just a couple examples. I've had many good conversations today with people who are sort of blown away by there is an actual job to go break into physical buildings. So these are just some examples of the things, and you may look at this and be like, well, that's just trash that I have in my kitchen, right? And oftentimes that is the case, right? So this is just a piece of stamped metal, it's a shove knife, and it does have certain metallurgical properties that make it able to have really good memory of its shape, so it bends back nicely. And we're able to hook that and bypass that anti-shim pin. So if you are familiar with this latch mechanism here, and next time you go through a door, take a look, that is the shim pin right there. And so we're able to get around that, depress that, and then hook the latch and ultimately get through from the outside. This is an exterior door of the city that we were able to get in. Similar concept with the Shrum. However, we really like the Aquafina water bottles. Those have some really fantastic properties. So if you're ever looking to make one, I don't know why you would want to, but if you were ever curious, that is really much better than using your credit card, which when I was 10 and trying with my parents' credit card, I may have damaged a few of those. So this is much better. Use the water jugs. And then lastly, this hook tool. So you'll notice you've got these panic bars, and this is an exterior door here, and you can see the light shining through here, and you can slide this in, rotate it 90 degrees, and then pull it, and then depress that panic bar from the outside. And so there are really easy solutions for facilities to fix this, such as putting a plate along here from the outside, so then that plate overlaps and closes that gap, or to tighten the door down. Buildings are really challenging to harden though, right? There are buildings that contract and they swell and seasonality happens, and there are all sorts of considerations in terms of how do you protect that over multiple seasons and different weather conditions. So we also have, especially in the Willamette Valley here, a lot of really moist conditions, and the ground also does a fair bit of swelling. Some other physical considerations here. So the HID procs, so this is a commercial tool. It looks really fancy and it does a really good job, but you can also weaponize other things for greater distance, like garage door readers. This allows us to copy RFID badges. So if you go through doors, or if you just even look around this building, you may find that there are some that say HID on it. That is a brand of RFID badge. There are a number of insecurities, and there are also some downgrade attacks. So with this particular technology, it is relatively easy, especially with the more legacy protocols, to initiate a remote activation. So like next time you use a badge, what's happening is it's being energized, and then it's transmitting the information that is stored within your card. And so you can actually get a fair degree of distance, about up to 18 inches, if your device is big enough to make that activation. So fortunately, there are secure versions of that, and those secure versions do come with some degree of cost, but the legacy protocols are really where we see the issues. Rec sensors. So this is a really hard image to read. You can see that there is a red arrow, but that is about all you can probably see. So what we're doing here is there is a sensor here, and then we are able to activate that. And so typically what the rec sensor does is it is recognizing a temperature differential, and then it is using that differential to activate a door for egress as someone walks up to it. It gets the temperature of the ambient air, and then it sees the person coming through there. Well, you can actually bypass these when that delta is disabled because it's not actually detecting that heat differential, it's just detecting motion. So maybe you have seen YouTube videos of various internet personalities like the Lockpicking Lawyer or Deviant Olem, and it's a very similar concept where you're either blowing compressed air through there to just get that motion and trigger that, or you are doing a balloon through the door. Typically what we recommend is there are ways to have secure ADA compliant egress mechanisms even with that. So of course, make sure that the delta isn't disabled on those if you have that responsibility, but also just having buttons push to exit in combination with that detection of the motion. And then lastly, for the people who like the locks in the room, secure is a little bit of a loaded term here when you leave the key in the padlock. This is unfortunately all too common. And I was actually in my local credit union last night, and I happened to notice that they had the cash cart where they were going around to all the tills. And on this cart, and you can imagine just like a catering cart or something else, it's probably about 4 feet long by 1.5 feet wide, 4 feet tall. And it had all of the tills for all of the tellers, and all of those were locked. But they had a nice row of about 12 keys on the side of this cart for those cash drawers. So if you just keep an eye out as you go about your life in the world, you will probably see a fair number of things that stand out as you could probably think of a better way to do that. The challenge is how do you do that securely and also scale. Next example is a large city. So this was a covert red team engagement, and this was for a really sizable city. So annual budget over 15 million. They had over 100 dedicated IT staff members. They had security staff members. And this was a very targeted engagement. So it was not comprehensive in that we weren't trying to find every vulnerability. We were just tasked with a few very specific things. So they knew that they had some issues with their SAP environment, so they wanted us to give them some good, actionable information about that so they could go to their leadership and help be an external advocate and say, this is a vulnerability, we just haven't been able to get the traction to fix it, here's the worst case outcome. They also knew of some segmentation issues between SAP and their main corporate environment. We did have a 14-day window, and we had a 5-day on-site window. So this was where we largely went in completely covertly. There was only 1 or 2 people within the entire city that knew of this and authorized this. And then we were trying to really demonstrate that access. We also had a few people who were remote operators, so we were trying to deploy C2 payloads on workstations, rogue devices on the network to facilitate getting the C2 infrastructure operational. Again, as we saw in the other example, I'll have a nice diagram that walks through this, but some key highlights there. That in-person social engineering really showcased a major deficiency. So we had pretty full access. We were able to wander around the building. The individuals that we sent on site had IT help desk backgrounds, and so they were actually helping people print. They were getting themselves socialized, and they were wandering around the different floors, evading the actual IT technicians of the city, but they were going up and down floors and like helping Jenny in accounting actually solve problems to build that credibility and build that accountability and find the other deficiencies while they were moving freely between the different floors of the building. As noted, we did see some RFID badge issues similar to that former image you saw, and also we found those badges unattended. So we were able to we didn't actually need to get within someone's personal space to clone that badge. We found it on a desk, we were able to clone it, replicate it, put it right back where it was, and then move freely about the building as a quote-unquote authorized badge user. They did have some network access controls in place, which was great. However, they were susceptible to MAC address spoofing, where we were able to clone the MAC address off of a printer that didn't have the admin panel locked down. So again, we've all seen multifunction printers. Well, oftentimes you can print the configuration page off of those. You don't need to crawl under the desk or behind it to get that MAC address on that RJ45 connector. we were just able to print that page. From there, we were able to clone that onto a device and then circumvent the network access controls because it wasn't full authentication based. It was just checking that one variable. A lot of unlocked unattended workstations. So we were able to deploy C2 payloads there and get access. Interestingly, they were running a really prevalent high-end EDR solution, and I probably shouldn't say the name, but I will say they did have a major outage a summer or so ago, and you might be able to deduce who that was. And again, I do not mean to throw shade on them. They are a fantastic product. We come up against it on many, many engagements, but it is not perfect. And there are ways to evade even the highest end EDR solutions. And so just be aware that having a high-end product for EDR and threat detection is really important, but it's not going to prevent everything. And so even with that, we were able to get sensitive information off, and there were certain attacks that were quite noisy and were prevented, like extracting the memory of the LSAS process, but there wasn't the people behind those alerts actually monitoring. And so we were able to have several days where we were going through and running these attacks, running these exploits, but the Security Operations Center wasn't appropriately monitoring those. Yes, question?
Yeah, I'm curious if in the situation where this was being monitored and you did a noisy attack and it was identified, what does that look like on your end as the pen tester if you get caught?
Yeah, great question. So the question is, so if we were prevented and then the alert was being monitored and it got quote unquote caught, what does that look like on the perspective of the red team or the pen tester? So there's a couple things, right? So in a red team engagement like this, where the security staff wasn't in the know, there was just basically the signature authority knew about it, then that would have resulted in an investigation taking place, and then our contact was monitoring to make sure there wasn't a large wasted expenditure of FTE time or personnel time to investigate that and actually do that root cause analysis. So it would have resulted in being escalated and then confirmed as our activity. We do see on many engagements where it just doesn't work and we don't really know why it didn't work. In this case, we happened to have the eyes on the device because we were there in person and we could see it was failing because of EDR. So it really depends upon the specific scope of the engagement, but by and large, in a more open book engagement, it would be very collaborative to make sure there's not that wasted time on the blue team. Yes, another question.
As an add-on to that, what do you guys have in terms of like your get out of jail free card? So officer friendly after you're walking down the hallway, just doesn't recognize you, decides to investigate it, figures out that you just don't seem very official.
Yes. Yeah, so what do we have in terms of get out of jail free cards? So that is an interesting question because very, let's say, traditional advice would be to have that printed letter. But if Mr. Security Guard already doesn't trust me, and if I pull out a piece of paper that says I'm authorized to be here, if he's doing his job, he shouldn't accept that, right? And so typically what we do have on engagements like this is we have a trust verification process with our technical contacts. And so what that looks like is we do have a individual that is available and they are monitoring communications like their phone. So we can tell that security guard, first we're going to try and socially engineer them if they're in scope. So first we're going to try and sort of sidestep it and we're going to name drop. We're going to try and leverage him to actually build credibility. And sometimes we do see that where we're able to socially engineer that security guard, build that credibility, and then start having them escort us around the place. But let's say that wasn't successful, right? Let's say that they did actually stop us, they challenged us, they didn't buy our BS story. Then what we would do is like, okay, good job, you caught us, and this is the individual who is signed off on this project, and we work on de-escalation. So we're trained in de-escalation tactics. We just stay very calm, we're non-threatening about it. We then say, this is the individual, you please call them, reach out to them, we'll just stay here, and you can stay here with us. We're not gonna do anything. And then what typically happens is Mr. Security Guard calls our name contact, they pick up the phone, they say, yes, Josh is supposed to be there. This is a security word that only Josh would know. Ask Josh what the security word is. If it matches what I just told you, then that is the correct individual who should be there. Great questions. All right, so as promised, another diagram. I had a little too much fun with these diagrams. I hope you like them. So with this, we did see really that main entry point being the physical building, so getting in from there. None of this was done in a quote-unquote assume breach mentality, right? This was 100% covert, clandestine, getting into the building, moving across the floors, bypassing that network access control to get the C2. We see our 2 individuals operating back at home base, and then also we see unlocked unattended workstations, or UUWs, as we like to call them for short. And then we were able to deploy our payloads and get that C2 infrastructure and try pivoting throughout the environment. Really what I like in talking about sort of the standards here, right, is MITRE does a really good job talking about what the different layers are and mapping this back to. So from like a reporting and an after action report, understanding what are the common trends, what are the deficiencies, where are the areas that can be hardened and bolstered, making sure that there isn't just a person saying, yeah, this was bad, but there's whole external infrastructure and guidance to support that. So I've got about 5 minutes here, and I can get into one more example, or we can jump to key takeaways and have more time for questions. What is a temperature check? Do people feel like they have questions for me? Have they already answered them? Okay, maybe 1 or 2 more questions? Okay, so I'll just jump then to the example here, just for the diagram, because it's the most visually interesting. So this one was interesting because there was simply a guest password where we were able to get external access. There was MFA self-enrollment still enabled, so this individual had been with the organization for a while, but they were on site all the time, and they had never had a reason to set up MFA. And so we were able to guess that password and then just self-enroll our own device, because their onboarding process for the MFA allowed that the first time you sign in, you then enroll your device, as opposed to having to interact with a person on the service desk or when MFA is first rolled out. And so having sort of that fail open until that first time is really what was the downfall there. And then there was also external CGIS access where we were able to get into mailboxes. So this really calls back to having good inbox and mailbox hygiene. This is something that we see far too often where employees are using their mailboxes really as like file storage. And so maybe they've got spreadsheets there, they've got full records. In this case, we were able to see someone's whole rap sheet, and we were able to see what crimes that the police department thought they were involved in. And this was all externally accessible because of a guest password and because we were able to access conditional access policy from the outside. Some really nice positive things here, though, is the segmentation blocked access to the public works. So even though this city also had water infrastructure, we weren't really able to do much with it. We were stopped because of those strong firewall controls, and so we had pretty free run of the corporate side, but they had really good segmentation on the networking layer and the operational technology side. And then this is a example of a table from reporting just from a general client where you can see really where the systemic failures were, right? We weren't challenged on entry. We were able to roam through those buildings pretty freely. There weren't those verification calls made, so Mr. Security Guard challenged us. We gave a BS story, they bought it, and we were able to move through the city pretty unimpeded. And then some other deficiencies in terms of like monitoring. Once we were doing more of the collaborative side, we still had pretty free reign. So what are some key takeaways in the last few minutes here? So really the first thing is I want everyone to walk away from this talk knowing that if you are in a position and you really feel like it's a daunting task and maybe if you had more money or more budget, it would be a little bit easier. And I think that it would be easier for sure, but universally, your peers up and down are at a disadvantage, right? It doesn't matter how much money you have. We saw top 50 largest city, we saw small city, we saw medium-sized city. Everyone is having very similar challenges. And I think really focusing on building that strong foundation and making sure that that foundation is something that is scalable and can be built up, because it doesn't matter how much money you have. And I have seen organizations that have near unlimited budgets, they just throw tools at the problem, but they don't understand what they're doing and they don't have the right people or the right process or governance in place. And oftentimes they're worse off because they have a false sense of security, thinking that those tools are going to fix everything for them. Making sure those existing frameworks really are building in a conduit for that internal dialogue, right? Making sure that the internal security program is efficient by leveraging your external resources like NIST, like MITRE, and making sure that you're not trying to reinvent the wheel on everything, but you're taking advantage of those resources that you have available to you. Number 4 there, role-based access controls are often falling short. So what I mean by that is we do see a lot of engagements where there are things that fall outside of the intent. We're seeing this more and more with Copilot and Purview as that's trying to be rolled out, and improper data classification and data governance is really struggling with things like Copilot, but also this notion of privilege drift, right? So as roles change, as positions change, maybe people move from being an IT technician up to being a manager, a lot of times those permissions still exist. And so you probably don't need your IT manager who hasn't reset a password in 5 years having domain admin privileges still. They're not running updates on a DC anymore. No EDR platform is infallible, right? I've seen high-end, I've seen low-end. They all have some similar issues. Some are absolutely better, but make sure that you have a good layered defensive model. The analogy that I like to use here is the model of Swiss cheese, right? There are going to be holes, but you don't want any of those 2 holes to line up. So if you take a block of cheese, Swiss cheese specifically, you spin it around 360 degrees, you don't want to be able to see through from one end to the other through this object that you know that there will be some issues with. And then lastly, really the network segmentation is highly effective, right? So whether that is fully air gapping systems, whether that is having strong authentication at the network device layer, these are really effective at preventing breaches and reducing the radius of an impact of breaches. So with that, always happy to talk. I'm over, so I have negative 27 seconds. I think we're running up to a break though, and no one has pulled me off. So one question? Yes.
What's the level of impact and success that you've seen with user training? Like, have you seen companies that said they're like, hey, we have a pretty in-depth, or like in their opinion, we have a really in-depth user training program. Did you notice a pretty substantial impact from like using a tool like KnowBe4 or actually having people internally setting up that user training? What was your experience?
Yeah, so to restate that, what is my experience like? Do I notice a correlation between people who say they have a really strong user education program and then also the results and how people actually... So what I have seen is things that are pretty, let's say, canned and repetitive, right? They don't increase critical thinking. That's really where it falls short. And so when I do exactly what you're talking about, like live training sessions for staff, that's one of the things I'm bringing up is like, how do you apply critical thinking here? How do you internalize and think about, I am a custodian of the sensitive data, of the access. How are people going to attack me specifically? And trying to make that a little bit more real. Yes?
Can you talk about what the pillars are for a good foundation in an IT department? It's on your first point on the last slide.
Yeah. So what are some pillars? So really having clear roles and responsibilities, right? You need to have good governance and structure, and you also need to make sure that you have a separation of duty. So the person building the system is going to be a little bit internally biased, and so having someone else that doesn't report to them that is really being the check and the balance there. So if you have the luxury of that many positions, have a different reporting chain, right? Have those people go up a layer and not through each other. So that's really one good pillar. And then on the user side, right, really building in a culture of cybersecurity awareness, not just on the cyber side, but the physical side, the social side, and building that culture of it's okay to make mistakes, but let's talk about and how we can avoid them in the future. So those are 2. And I suspect they probably want me to get out of here. So I will be here, though, for the rest of the day if anyone wants to talk to me.
Before you go, you inferred a couple occasions about the physical cyber convergence, but you didn't really touch it. I mean, it's kind of like the third rail. So we're seeing a lot of threat vectors being exploited and specific for a physical cyber convergence attack.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we have long believed that the physical side really is a key component of it. We've been doing sort of like the physical assessment side for about 20 years. And the convergence of it, I think, is really as we start to see more sophisticated attackers and as we also see attacks that are perhaps not just financially motivated, but politically motivated or civil unrest, that has really started to raise more awareness of that. And so how we're approaching that is really trying to engage more on the facilities side, right? Who actually has ownership of that? We used to just engage specifically with the IT departments. Now we're trying to engage with the facility side and educate there. So we often do a lot of in-person time where we walk through and say, okay, let's take a look at these 2 buildings as examples and train you on the facilities team how to harden these common vulnerabilities. And now you can go propagate that out. We're also seeing a lot of new construction where there are buildings that are going up quicker and faster that are having physical deficiencies. We had this really large electric power generation client, brand new, gorgeous HQ, 250 doors, we're just missing some key parts. And we were able to find that, and then they were able to bring the contractor back in under warranty and then fix that for them because they had neglected and were negligent in their duties there. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Josh. Appreciate that.